Somewhere in Florida, in an evidence room you'll never see, sits a cardboard box. Inside that box, a piece of clothing, a strand of hair, maybe a single drop of blood preserved for decades. That box has been sitting there since before some of us were born, waiting. And now, in 2026, the technology has finally caught up. I'm going to walk you through what's happening right now in state crime labs across America. This is Case Files Explained. 21,000. That's the number of unsolved murders sitting in Florida's files right now. 21,000 families who never got answers. Some have been waiting 60 years. But here's where it gets interesting. The state of Florida just committed $600,000 to change that. They're partnering with a lab that's already cracked 600 cases nationwide. And Florida isn't alone. Indiana's already months ahead. Their genetic genealogy team has solved cases from the 1970s. The 1970s. So what changed? How does this technology actually work, and what does it mean for the thousands of families still waiting for that phone call? To understand what's happening now, we need to go back to 2018. Sacramento, California. That's where forensic genetic genealogy proved what it could do. The Golden State Killer. For 40 years he'd evaded capture. Dozens of victims, multiple jurisdictions. Every traditional investigative method had failed. Then investigators tried something new. They took DNA from an old crime scene, uploaded the genetic profile to a public genealogy database, and started building family trees. Not the killer's family tree, distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who'd submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry, never imagining it would lead police to their relative. Traditional genealogy took it from there: birth records, marriage certificates, death notices, working backward through generations until they narrowed it down to a single suspect. Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested in April 2018, 72 years old. Living quietly in the suburbs. The case that broke the technology wide open. But here's the thing about breakthroughs. They take time to scale. That arrest was 2018. It's taken years for states to build the infrastructure to use this technology systematically. Which brings us to April 2026. Florida Attorney General James Uthmeier announced a $600,000 partnership with Othram, a Texas-based forensic DNA laboratory. The scope: more than 21,000 unsolved murders spanning 6 decades, cases from the 1960s sitting alongside evidence from last year. All potentially solvable. Othram isn't a newcomer to this work. According to the company's own data, their technology has helped solve at least 600 cold cases across the country. The company specializes in extracting usable DNA from degraded samples, evidence that's been sitting in boxes for decades, samples that traditional labs couldn't process. Here's how the Florida program works. The state's Department of Law Enforcement will screen potential evidence, coordinating lab work with investigative follow-up across all judicial circuits. It's a triage system. They'll prioritize cases based on evidence quality, likelihood of DNA extraction, and importantly, whether living witnesses or suspects might still be identified. But Florida's program is just getting started. To see what's possible when genetic genealogy teams have time to develop, look at Indiana. Indiana State Police launched their Forensic Investigative Genetic Genealogy team, they call it FIGG, about 2 years ago, and they've been busy. They've already cracked cases dating back to 1975. Think about that. A murder that happened during the Ford administration, solved in 2024 or 2025 using DNA that sat in evidence for 50 years. The Indiana governor's office put it plainly: advances in forensic technology, paired with the newly formalized genetic genealogy unit, have helped crack cases that seemed permanently cold. The FIGG approach combines traditional detective work with advanced DNA analysis. It's not just about the science, it's about the legwork that comes after. Once you get a DNA match to a distant relative, you still need to build the family tree. Interview people. Verify alibis. Collect new samples for comparison. That takes experienced investigators. And here's the challenge that doesn't make headlines: this technology isn't cheap. A single genetic genealogy test can cost thousands of dollars. For smaller jurisdictions, that's often prohibitive. NBC News documented how some families have turned to crowdfunding to pay for DNA testing on their loved ones' cases. Justice apparently has a price tag. That's part of what makes state-level programs like Florida's so significant. When a state commits $600,000, it means smaller counties don't have to choose between solving a murder and fixing a patrol car. The Florida initiative specifically mentions coordination across judicial circuits. That's important. Murder doesn't respect county lines, and neither should the investigation. Consider this: 21,000 unsolved murders in one state alone. Florida's population is about 23 million. That's roughly one unsolved murder for every 1,000 residents. Now, I want to be clear about what genetic genealogy can and can't do. It's powerful, but it's not magic. There are real limitations. First, you need viable DNA. Not every crime scene has it. Evidence degrades over time. Some samples from the 60s and 70s may be too damaged to yield usable profiles. Second, genetic genealogy depends on databases. The more people who've submitted DNA to ancestry services, the better the chances of finding a relative. Not everyone has. Third, and this is crucial, the suspect has to still be alive or at least identifiable through living relatives. Some killers from the 1960s are already dead. Their cases may close, but justice remains incomplete. Critics have raised legitimate privacy concerns about this technology. When you submit your DNA to an ancestry service, you're not just revealing information about yourself, you're revealing information about every blood relative you have. Your third cousin submits a sample to learn about their ancestry. Years later, that sample helps police build a family tree that leads to you, or someone in your family. You never consented to that. There are real questions here about informed consent and genetic surveillance. These databases weren't built for law enforcement. People signed up to learn about their heritage, not to help catch killers. But here's the counter-argument, and it's compelling. Families of murder victims have been waiting decades for answers. For them, privacy debates feel academic when someone they loved is still in an unmarked grave. The Golden State Killer case set precedent. Courts have largely upheld the use of public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes. The legal framework is still evolving, but the door is open. What's changed in 2026 is the scale. We've moved from individual high-profile cases to systematic state programs. This isn't one detective getting creative, this is coordinated infrastructure. Florida's $600,000 investment isn't a pilot program. It's a declaration: we're going to work through this backlog systematically, case by case, year after year. Indiana's FIGG team has been operating for about 2 years now. They've built internal expertise, developed protocols, created relationships with genealogy researchers. That institutional knowledge takes time. Other states are watching. When Florida and Indiana announce breakthroughs, when they identify killers who've been walking free for 50 years, other legislatures will notice. The question isn't whether genetic genealogy works. We know it does. The question is whether states will fund it at the scale needed to address backlogs that span decades. So what does this mean for families of cold case victims? First, if you have an unsolved case in your family, you might consider reaching out to your state's law enforcement agency to ask about genetic genealogy programs. Organizations like the DNA Doe Project accept case submissions. If official channels are slow, crowdfunding for DNA testing has become more common. It shouldn't have to be that way, but it is. If you've taken a consumer DNA test yourself, you may want to consider the privacy implications. Your genetic information could potentially be used in investigations involving any blood relative, present or future. That's not necessarily a reason not to participate, but it's worth understanding what you're consenting to, and what consent even means when your DNA reveals information about people who never submitted a sample. For those interested in the intersection of genealogy and criminal justice, there are emerging career paths. Genetic genealogists who work with law enforcement are in high demand, and there aren't enough of them. The technology will keep improving. Extraction methods are getting better at working with degraded samples. Databases are growing. Machine learning is speeding up the genealogy research process. But the human element remains essential. Someone has to interpret the results, someone has to conduct the interviews, someone has to present the case to prosecutors. Technology assists, it doesn't replace. Indiana's success with cases from 1975 proves something important. The evidence doesn't have an expiration date if it's been properly preserved. The DNA is patient, it waits. For 50 years, that evidence sat in an Indiana storage facility, a piece of fabric, a hair follicle, something so small it fit in a vial. But it contained the answer. The family waited. The detective who originally worked the case retired, maybe passed away. Witnesses moved, memories faded. But the DNA didn't change. It couldn't lie. It just waited to be read. When the Indiana team solved that 1975 case, they weren't just closing a file. They were answering a question that had haunted a family for half a century. That's what this technology is really about. 21,000 unsolved murders in Florida. Cases from 1965 through 2025. 60 years of families wondering what happened, who did it, whether they'd ever know. $600,000 is a start. It won't solve all 21,000 cases, but it will solve some of them. And that's more than nothing. If this kind of story interests you, the intersection of technology, justice, and cold case investigation, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this regularly. And a like really does help more people find this content. If you know someone with an interest in true crime or forensic science, you might share this episode with them. The DNA revolution in cold case investigation is happening right now, not someday. Not eventually. Right now, in state crime labs across America, families who've been waiting decades might finally get calls. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with it might finally face consequences. Evidence that seemed useless might finally speak. For Case Files Explained, I'm going to leave you with this thought. Somewhere in Florida right now, an evidence box is being pulled from a shelf. Its contents are being photographed, cataloged, swabbed for DNA. A sample will go to a lab in Texas. A genetic profile will be uploaded. Family trees will be built. And maybe, a family that's been waiting 60 years will finally get an answer. The technology is here. The funding is starting to flow. The question now is simple: how many answers can we find before it's too late? This is Case Files Explained. We'll see you next time.